Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
You're ready. Okay. Hi, this is Matthew Baldwin of Mars Hill University, and this is the Ideas of Jesus video podcast, episode 9, I think. And I'm here today with Dr. Richard Newton of the University of Alabama. Thanks for being here, Richard. I'm really glad we could have this talk.
I'm so glad this is happening. Thanks for making it happen.
It's great. I'd like to introduce you to my viewers and students. Richard Newton is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa. Dr. Newton holds a PhD in religion from Claremont Graduate University, where he worked under the supervision of Vincent Wimbush, developing his expertise in critical comparative scriptures. He brings an anthropological approach to religious studies, but also has theological training and training in the classic methods of biblical studies. Dr. Newton has spoken, published, and appeared in far too many venues, issues, and volumes to mention by name. He writes and teaches on a broad array of topics. His work touches on religious studies theory, pop culture and science fiction, race, American culture, politics, myth, scripture, writing, teaching, and more. He is active in the North American Association for the Study of Religion and several other scholarly societies, and is the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin for the Study of Religion. Richard has just published a revised version of his dissertation, Identifying Roots, Alex Haley and the Anthropology of Scriptures, that's with Equinox, 2020, and is working on a new monograph, Signifying Religion, an African-American Worldview, a volume which I assume will examine, develop, and advance the perspective on religion and religious studies that stands in the tradition of the historian of religion, Charles H. Long, and of Dr. Newton's doctoral advisor, Vincent Wimbush, among others. Well, Dr. Long just passed away earlier this year at the age of 93, and I think maybe it is not too much to say that his passing in this year particularly marks something of an epoch in the study of religion and in the politics of race, in American culture, and in academia. He will be missed, but also I think his work is just beginning to be rediscovered and considered afresh. So I'm looking forward to reading your study, Richard, and in part because of that. So I brought you here today, in part, to discuss how the contemporary study of Jesus looks from the perspective of this signifying scriptures approach. So to begin, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to start by quickly explaining how Wimbush, you, and others, including I think Long, use this term signifying, and what this approach brings to the study of scriptures.
So I think the power of this term signification for scholars of religion sort of emerges from two distinct but also related discourses. And Long captures this in his work. Actually, he captures it in epigraphs at the very beginning of his book, Significations. And he talks about this one African-American proverb that goes like, signifying is worse than lying. And then he also quotes Ferdinand de Saussure, the semiotician linguist, who talks about the arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified. And so you see semiotics and you see sort of African-American cultural and intellectual history. And Long himself kind of brings this together in his work to think about like what we're doing when we talk about religion, trying to make sense of the world. And when it comes to scriptures, Vincent Wimbush's, I think, real intervention into the field of not only biblical studies, but the history of religions and cultural politics is recognizing that human beings are constantly trying to make sense of the world, orient themselves, orient others around media, around discourse, and with discourse, and through discourse. And so he sort of hones in on this concept of signification as a way to say that the focus of our attention as scholars should not be on the fanciful things that we create, produce, and fabricate, but on the things that we keep coming back to make sense of the world, and we forget that they are our own productions. And so for me, the way that I've approached this is by thinking about scriptures not as text, not as an ontological thing, but rather in anthropological terms. That scriptures are the texts that we read, but that also seem to read us back. And what are the politics, what are the histories, what are the dynamics that present that sort of relationship where we produce these media, but it also seems that these media read us back and make sense of who we are. So that's signifying in sort of a nutshell.
So would it be fair to say that signifying is as much about how people use scriptures as it is about what scriptures are saying, like philologically or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's recognizing that there's no such thing as looking at the text simply as text. There's no such thing as looking at language as simply, phonemes and phonetics. That it's always about the people using and engaging these texts, using an engaging language, what they think they are expressing when relating with one another. The way I often think about this with signification is that if you can take any sort of social act or any engagement of people and say, there's a signifier or a person doing something with signs, right? Pointing people's attention to this or that and filling those signs with meaning. So my introductory students often have to memorize this sort of saying that's become famous in my classes. The world is full of potential signs to be signified by a signifier. The world is full of potential signs to be signified by a signifier. So what are people doing when they're looking around in the world and trying to make sense of it and others and themselves inside?
The world is full of potential signs to be signified by a signifier.
By a signifier. That's right.
Now I'm tempted, I usually try to keep my interviews at a low jargon level, but I'm really tempted to go into like Persian semiotics and relate this to Peirce's triadic notion of the sign and things. Maybe we can have that conversation another time. The interpretant.
So tempting, right?
What's that?
It's so tempting, isn't it?
It really is.
And I think to me, the sort of one of the major contributions of someone like Charles Long is that he could go there. I mean, he was well familiar before a lot of historians of religion with Derrida and de Saussure and all these people, but he was very much a storyteller and very much about keeping it real with his prose and with his language. He was quite the wordsmith in that way. And I think that's a real challenge for us who are really trying to make sense of what people do is how do we keep it real with our language? And the stakes are high. And he sort of sets a high bar for us to meet in doing that kind of work. So we're up to it. We can handle it.
Okay. Well, looking from this vantage point of thinking about the world as full of potential signs to be signified by a signifier, we kind of want to draw this towards the topic of Jesus. But in order to do that, I think that I'd really be curious to hear what you think about the contemporary scholarship on Jesus in general, or studies focused on early Christianity, Christian origins, and Jesus. And really, I'm wondering what you might say scholars today are typically doing right, and what they're doing wrong in their work on Jesus.
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of people in the business of thinking about ideas of Jesus. And I think one of the promising things that I'm seeing is the sort of meta-reflection or really conscientious, critical thinking about why we're even looking at Jesus to begin with. I mean, right. I think that move alone is well overdue, and it's high time that we do it. And I'm just celebrating the fact that we're getting there.
Right, we're on the fourth quest for the historical Jesus, but have we ever stopped to ask why we keep questing?
That's right. The fact that we turned back for a second is that's progress, ironically. And I think where we can continue to do some more work is by thinking about what we're pointing to with all of our sort of hermeneutical approaches and philological science and even comparative and deep textual criticism and even historical criticism. Like, what are we really building here? I mean, I think about this a lot in my own graduate training, because when I grew up in Texas, and I went into college wanting to do like historical Jesus stuff. Like, I literally searched, like, I want to study Jesus and about the first century in Galilee and what was going on there when I was looking for colleges. And I landed at TCU, Texas Christian University, where I studied with a guy named Daryl Schmidt, who was behind one of the Westar Institutes, like the Jesus Seminars, translations of Mark and the Gospels and things. And I didn't know what the Jesus Seminar was or any of that, but he was like really involved with that. And I was fascinated by what he was doing. I was challenged by it for sure, theologically. But as I went into graduate study from there, I went to a seminary where everything was about connecting the Jewish world to the world of the New Testament. Like if you want to make sense of Jesus, you got to know what's going on in the quote unquote Hebrew Bible. And we were talking about it in terms of Hebrew Bible usually.
Mm-hmm.
But when I did my PhD work, it was all about, and I moved to California at Claremont Graduate University, it was like, it's all about the Greek world. It's all about Rome. It's all about, you know, like the Socratic and all this stuff and Homer and you got to know Coptic. And I was like, what? But I studied Hebrew back there and learned about, who cares? It's about the Greek. And I was like, what happened? I thought I was doing this history thing. And I think what we could stand to do in the study of Jesus and the idea of Jesus is ask, why are we attracted to these different shiny approaches to making sense of who Jesus is in the world to which Jesus presumably belongs? I want to return to, and perhaps never really left, why when I was in Texas, it was all about the Hebrew Bible and Jewish origins. But when I was in California, it was about Greece and Rome and Egypt and that. I think there are many conversations like that could be had by a whole range of scholars that would send us in a really good direction.
Yeah, and I suspect that would be a good conversation to have with someone like Bill Arnall, but I'm not sure, you know, we're ready to go there just together in this particular interview.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating question to ask, though. Do you think it has something to do with the importance within the Christian theological circle to be thinking about Jesus in terms of his relationship to some idea about Judaism versus Claremont's focus on turning outwards into this larger study of religion? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element, you know, for the very like Judeo-centric approach to studying Jesus. I think a couple of things were involved. For one, there was a real interest in trying to combat like supersessionism, right? Like saying that the New Testament is perfecting the Old Testament in some way. I think there was a real move to try to relocate Jesus within that world to do right by Judaism. I also think, particularly with the people that I studied with and the train of thought that I was on, which was very like archaeology oriented, there was a sense that the data in the ground, the so-called fifth gospel, was pointing toward not very much evidence about the role of like Rome or Greece, or sort of paganism or whatever, but was really about, this was a really local, small setting where Jesus was coming about. And what do we do with that? And how do we sharpen our understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus is about? So I was very much influenced by like Mark Chancey, who was writing about like the myth of the Gentile Galilee, and Jonathan Reed and Eric Myers in that camp. It was very influential on what I was doing. When I moved to Claremont, it was more toward Jesus, redescribing Jesus and early Christianity in light of a broader Mediterranean world. And I think it was to sort of showcase the sophistication of not only the rise of early Christians, but also the scholars who study them. And I think there was a need to sort of hold down that turf. And you're sort of seeing battling audiences and battling scholars there.
Oh, wow. So we've started to get into this next question that I have for you, which is that, you know, I know that you've been involved in research projects and teams that have been specifically looking at images of Jesus in scholarship and culture. I'd really like to hear a little bit more about that and where that sort of research has led you to in your own thinking about Jesus. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I mean, one thing that really comes to mind that kind of pushed me out of my comfort zone was a seminar I was a part of with the Calvin College has these summer institutes I think that are funded by the Lilly Foundation. And they do these like sort of summer institutes. And I went to one on The Color of Christ, Ed Blum and Paul Harvey's work on Jesus and sort of American religious history and the sort of idea of Jesus and also depictions of Jesus, engagements with the idea of Jesus. And Ed Blum brought together artists, journalists, literary critics, religion scholars, like people from a whole range of different sort of sectors interested in this Jesus idea, pastors, of course. And we were in this seminar, probably 12 people or so, where we were reading art history, we were reading American religious history, we were learning about techniques in sort of iconography and sort of depiction and sort of the development of sort of Jesus hagiography and how to showcase Jesus. We're also looking at pop culture too, and that all of this would be part of a sort of similar conversation related to the idea of Jesus, especially when it comes to race, showed me that there are a lot of different ways we might look at this question, that we might do this kind of interrogation. And we need to hold our hands loosely, more loosely than we're often accustomed to in biblical studies, to really start to think about what people are up to when thinking about Jesus. I think I learned a lot of humility in that scene, because it was like, who cares about what the Bible says? Let's look at what people do with the Bible. Let's look at what people draw when they're drawing Jesus. Let's look at why they're thinking about Jesus. And it really made me rethink some things about how meaning making works, how signifying works, if you will.
No, that's fascinating. It sounds right, like something I would myself be really interested in having been. I'm jealous that you got to do that. It sounds really interesting.
I mean, the cool thing about it was, really it was part engagement of bibliography that was new to all of us. Ed Blum and Paul Harvey's book, The Color of Christ, is really fascinating in and of itself. But then also looking at, like Pelican's, like
right,
early Christian, like putting those things together, or David Morgan's work on sort of images of Jesus and iconography, putting these things together, was I think what made the seminar what it was. And of course we did that with people, but also even just with the books, it's kind of cool to emulate that, because we don't often get to be so adventurous in our readings, especially in the academy. It's like, stick to your subfield and your sub-subfield.
Right.
Like don't go over there, and don't spend too much time over there. I think we could stand to do that, especially in biblical studies.
So that kind of, it sounds like you've already answering my next question, which is really kind of like, what should that young scholar or the potential young scholar, the person maybe such as yourself, who's thinking about, who's gotten interested in biblical studies or who's gotten interested in studying Jesus in culture or in history, what should they be bearing in mind when they're approaching how to get oriented in this field and what they should be looking at?
I think the best piece of advice that I got that was so good that I don't even remember who gave it to me was to, actually I know who it was. It was Katie Cannon, Katie Geneva Cannon, famous womanist theologian who also died in this last year, who actually wanted to study Hebrew Bible, wanted to get a PhD in Hebrew Bible, and because of the racism in the academy, couldn't. And she started her own discourse in womanist theology, pretty impressively. One of the things that she said and would pass on to graduate students was to keep a journal and just keep writing your ideas down. No matter how silly or stupid you think they are, write them down because they're good. You just don't know why yet. And I think that's something that we could stand to do in biblical studies, rather than trying to find the thing that no one's thought of. Let's pay attention to the things that we are thinking of as we go, and keep that in mind. Hold on to those things, because we'll start to connect the dots of those constellations eventually. We'll see what comes of it. We just have to kind of trust the process of our own curiosity. And in doing that, I think the way we can continue to do that is to find conversation partners who are willing to engage, and don't be afraid to engage those who are in other spaces. Find the literary critics, find the cultural studies people, find the art historian. Even if they make you feel uncomfortable and out of your depth, there's something to be gained there that if you go in sort of with an open hand, you'll bring something back to those questions. And you'll start to see new things that you didn't know were there.
That's incredible advice. I think that's really great. Great. Thanks, Richard. So in your work as a teacher, you, like me, you find yourself teaching courses on Bible or New Testament, early Christianity. And just as a fellow teacher, now I'm really kind of almost looking for advice for myself. But I'm curious, and I'm wondering what you might say about how you approach talking about Jesus in your courses. Like, do you talk about the historical Jesus? Are we moving past that in our intro surveys? If you do talk about the historical Jesus, what do you say about him? And if not, why not? Or what do you talk about instead?
I love teaching New Testament. I don't do it as often as I'd like. I usually do it about once a year. But it'd be the course that I would teach every year or every semester just because it's so much fun. It's a class where I see a lot of student engagement, where the students don't seem to mind reading. I mean, they mind reading, but not as much as you would think. I think because what I try to surface is that there are real stakes to how we talk about Jesus and how we approach these ideas of Jesus. I think that's something I put out on the table really early, that like what people say about Jesus matters in our context, on our campus, in our country, in an election. And I start off with that sort of modern sensibility. And I say, well, in our context, how are we going to have a conversation or investigation of those things? We can't privilege one's background in that, right? We have to be able to put things on the table and see how far we can all take it. We can't say, well, God told me so. So then what does that mean for us? And in all of my classes, it usually means that we have to recognize that we're probably going to be offended, but then my job as a teacher is to set the ground rules to make sure no one's oppressed. And so once we do that, what does an inquiry into the study of Jesus look like? And I actually think going back to the sort of quote unquote historical is really important, because in this moment there's a tendency to want to say, well, we don't need the historical Jesus. We don't need to look at the first century. You don't need to look at any of that old dusty stuff. That's the area of like white men from so and so who only cared about this. And I think that's not only a simplification of the scholars who put in work, but also the politics that play around that. And I think actually what we can do is look at how the politics that we think are so prevalent in our contemporary society are actually prevalent there too. And so it becomes, again, a focus not on text, but what people are doing with texts. I sort of reframe historical criticism. I use that phrase, historical criticism, but the way that I look at it is we are going to examine the New Testament as a text, an artifact, and a social world. So whenever we talk about something we call the New Testament or part of the New Testament, we're going to think about it as a text. In literary terms, we're going to think about it as a historical artifact, and we're going to think about it as representative of social world and psychology and sociology and anthropology and all that, politics.
I love that. Love that threefold distinction. That's great.
I kind of get it from Milton Moreland had a book between text and artifact, integrating archaeology into the study of the Bible or something by, I think it was SBL Press actually. I think I got it from one of those boxes that faculty use to dump books that they're no longer reading. I used to take all that stuff as a student. I mean, I think that's what we do as students. This will be good, right? That's what half my library is, the stuff that I took as an undergrad and graduate student. But that was one of the books. And the idea of thinking about how can I do that in the classroom with students has always kind of captivated me. And I want to say that in the New Testament class that there are some real tensions at play that take us into potentially counterintuitive areas, whether it's, I generally just still listen to Hellenization, Romanization, and Judaization, knowing that none of those terms means one thing, but actually they're all arguments about how to make sense of the world in different standpoints in the Mediterranean in the first century, Second Temple period. And how is the New Testament sort of smack dab in the middle of all that, a matrix to see those politics? And that's what we do.
Yeah, see, I'm always worried in my New Testament classes that I'm just like reinscribing the authority of a canonical selection of texts. And particularly with studying Jesus, I worry that, you know, we read Mark and then we read Matthew and we read Luke and we read John, and I have to deal with the anti-Semitism in John and how it just comes right to the fore and presents itself for a certain reader of the text as an authoritative account, you know. And then, but I like your threefold distinction of text, social world, and artifact. If you can figure out how to foreground what you called the fifth gospel, like the archaeological world and what's actually going on the ground, what we can maybe say about that, maybe that's the secret to.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I like to do like case. Yeah, like I like to do case studies in a way. I guess I think about them as case studies. I probably never use that phrase in that class, but I pick a few key moments to sort of unpack themes or give students opportunities to kind of recognize tensions that they might miss if they were just reading from like cover to cover or something. I mean, like an example might be, you know, we can take coins. And like, you can go to Amazon, I certainly did, went to Amazon and bought some like replica first century coins, right? And start to look at like, well, what's on these coins? What are the phrases that are on these coins? And how do we see parallels in the New Testament? You know, what's it mean to talk about the Acts of the Apostles next to, you know, some of the other acts from the Mediterranean, the Arnold Brethren and things. And, you know, like what happens then? When we compare these to say that the New Testament's not all that special, but it's also special for like what's unfolding seems to be special or interesting and even threatening to certain people. Like, how does that work? I also want to complicate the humans being discussed. Like, there are a lot of people who are, I mean, some of our phrases like anti-Semitism, Roman, Jewish, Greek, Pharisee, all these terms kind of presuppose an application that people fit into these nice discrete boxes. And that's so not true in the 21st century. And it definitely is not true in the first century either. What if we go into the study of the New Testament thinking about the multitudes that people possess and by which we present people? How do we come to appreciate that? And students seem to be able to get into that. You know, to look at someone like Josephus and say, what's he all about? Is he really like, is he Jewish? What's it mean to be Jewish? How does he do Judaism? You know, like how does he do Jewish? How do we do anything like in terms of our identity and perform that? And I'll turn it back to my students and I'll say like, I hear you're in a fraternity. What's that mean?
Right.
Animal House? You know, is it party all the time? No, it's about service and brotherhood and philanthropy and all these things. Let's talk about the New Testament. Let's talk about collectives in the first century in these urban areas, right? And are these Christians just bonker cannibalists, you know, or whatever? Are they members of a guild? Are they trying to build a society? Are they trying to be good citizens? Like what is after that? You know, what's going on there? We can be just as sensitive to the tensions we're reading in the text as we are with each other on our best days. In our class, we try to bring that out a little bit more. What's it like to do this on our best days?
Yeah. Oh, wow. So you recently published some powerful work in which I think you really throw down the gauntlet, in my mind, in front of the American Academy of Religion in particular, but all of us, other scholarly organizations. The problem, in a word, is whiteness, and we might say the dominance or even supremacy of whiteness in scholarship on religion. And I'm wondering how we can apply some of your thinking about that. You might need to explain some of what you have to say about this for us, but how we might apply some of that to scholars who are working on images and ideas about Jesus, this problem, to correct for this problem of whiteness in the study of religion.
So when I think about whiteness, in biblical studies, the study of religion, I should first say that it's not something I want to talk about.
I'm sorry, then. I shouldn't have asked you.
No, I'm glad you did. But it, like, I didn't go out trying to write about whiteness. And what I tried to do, though, was to think about all the questions you're asking me and the ways that we are being honest and dishonest with ourselves to kind of carry out our work. And one of the things that I often see is that scholars of religion can gain a lot of points with each other, in the public eye, in our home institutions, by pointing out who's using the Bible incorrectly, who's not following the spirit of the law and holding themselves to the letter of the law, and not even the letter of the law, but to some weird machination that is just horrible and can't be true to the Bible. And I see this in public scholarship. I see this in interfaith dialogue. I see this in all these spaces. And I see it when our guilds come out with these statements about, we're here to make sure that we bring about good, solid religious literacy that is helpful for all. And I'm like, but it's not always helpful for all. In fact, much of the Bible is not a story that's helpful for all.
Right.
Helpful for a particular some who feel like they really need help. And I'm sure they want to care about other people, but right now they're just trying to figure out what to do and how to be. And so I just want to try and help us keep it real. And one area to do this is when it comes to the question of white supremacy, where what I see is, where I see a real big problem that I want to intervene on is when people think that white supremacy is the product of ignorance. I don't think white supremacy is the product of ignorance. I think it's a product of education. People are taught and disciplined to work under racist assumptions and paradigms. We have scriptures that we use and consult to invest and signify and build this racism that governs the value of bodies and lands and such. When it comes to interpretations of the Bible, I want us to just slow down and think about the ends to which we interpret the Bible, and the means by which we arrive at those ends. And often it benefits certain people, it comes out of certain needs, and we need to be mindful of that. And I think when we start pronouncing how good we are, we're cutting corners, and probably other people too. I want to slow us down from doing more harm than good.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I approach it.
Can you suggest maybe, I agree, I don't want to do harm. I want to do good, but I'm always never quite sure. It feels like I'm never quite sure whether or not I'm doing harm or good. Does that make sense? Like, if we're looking at a text, are we reinscribing its authority, a concern I mentioned earlier, or are we ignoring something that we could be reading that would be better? Are we implicitly, by selectively attending to one voice, are we implicitly ignoring another? Like, are there some practical steps that we could be implementing in the study of Jesus?
I think one thing that I try to do is to, I like to keep a list of sort of cliches or assumptions about how we approach Jesus. And I use these in class and pull them out depending upon sort of the way that the class seems to lean. Right. So the group of people that want to talk about Jesus being a peaceful character, I want to say, hold the phone. This guy came with a sword to divide households and right. People with ropes and flipping over tables and talking about stones and temples coming down. I mean, you try to do that looking like me. You know what I mean?
Right.
Can you get away with that? Who can get away with that? Right. I want to raise some of those questions. Maybe there was a reason why they killed Jesus, right? Well, and who was they and what were they afraid of? Right? I want to start unpacking that story, redescribing that story, if you will. For those who want to talk about Jesus not being against something like gun control or self-defense, which I get down here in Alabama in particular. I'm going to say, well, actually, it seems like, this whole turn the other cheek thing is kind of hardcore. And when you die, when you don't fight back, when you tell the guy with the knife to put it away, like that's not stand your ground anymore.
Right.
That like yielding, like what's that about, right? Like how does that work? I think there's vignettes like that we can use to sort of show the complexity, right? Especially when we compare the two or juxtapose the two, that is intriguing to students. And if I can keep them there just on that moment, the both and, the under what conditions, the when and how so, they can take it from there. They really can. I don't think I need to dazzle them with too much more than that.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds like, in part, it's about a flexibility, responding to an audience, and keeping the focus on the primary source materials that we have, that we're working with, whether it's the archaeology or the texts, and the social world that they're coming out of.
And the best students I've had, like the students who've been most effective in meeting our student learning outcomes and all those things, are often the ones that spent more time raising questions than jumping to the answers they think they have. I mean, I had one student in particular from Thailand who, before taking my New Testament class, was like, Dr. Newton, I've got to confess, I don't know anything about Christianity.
You're like, you're the perfect student.
Exactly. She's the one that aced the class. She's the one that decided with her notes that she would represent the different gospel accounts and groups representing these accounts, or whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, or even Paul versus like Peter, as a Twitter battle, and like had hashtags for them and like relocated debates and all this, that like she did that so well just to sort of help her organize her notes, and then she rocked the test. But other students, like on their test, were putting like hashtag, what was like hashtag like rock, hashtag, like all sorts of things, like little like slogans from the New Testament. That was like, that's not exactly the point, but I'm glad you're engaged.
Fantastic.
Like I have students journal a lot in New Testament where they're just like responding to kind of not oddball questions, but questions that don't necessarily have a single answer. Or I get them to do activities like draw a picture of this concept, and people think it's goofy. I've gotten pushback from it, but my students know a lot of stuff as a result.
Right.
And if I can get them there to appreciate just the idea that there's something to be engaged by raising questions, and that answers are kind of played out, but questions are sort of our job.
Yeah.
They'll bring far more to the text than I can prepare ahead of time.
That reminds me of two things. One is, of course, there's a famous interview, or no, it's not famous, but it's it's on YouTube, with J.Z. Smith, where he talks about having a good question being much better than having any answer. Answers, like you said, play out. He says they go to the wayside or whatever. And but the good question, that's something to hang on to. Yeah. And then we have a colleague at Mars Hill who's now in his 90s, a Holocaust survivor named Walter Ziffer, who's also a New Testament scholar. And his story is complicated. He converted to Christianity and then back to Judaism later in life. And he has a saying that I like to bring to students' attention, which is, if you're not asking questions, you're asking for trouble. Born out of the experience of his life.
Yeah.
I like that focus on questions.
Yeah, and it probably goes back, or could be traced back to the sort of idea of keeping a journal and writing those questions. You don't know why they're good yet, but just trust that they are. My job as a teacher is to help people sort of bring those questions out and return to them with new skills and tools and content knowledge, hoping that it'll create a backdrop with which they can sort of draw those connections and constellations to see something they wouldn't have seen otherwise.
That's fantastic. Well, I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, Richard, and I'm just so thankful for you spending your time sharing your expertise.
It was so much fun, so useful. I was taking notes for myself, so I have some really good things that I've learned and picked up from you. For the next time,
I'm going to be following up on The World is Full of Potential Signs to be Signified by a Signifier. And I'm going to make my students learn that.
I know.
To your credit. All right. Thanks again. And I'll be seeing you on the webs somewhere. All right. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.